Hi, everyone. It's Professor Floros in the Politics Classroom, a podcast of UIC Radio. Today, I'm going to bring you the rest of my conversation with UIC political science PhD candidate Semih Patan about recent political developments in Turkey. However, I have two other orders of business first. So let's get started in the Politics Classroom. First, my summary of the situation in Tunisia in the last episode was woefully inadequate. Much more has been happening that I missed in my explanation, and I want to take a few minutes here to go into more detail. I'm going to try to book a guest who can go into even more detail in a future episode. So if you know anyone who might be appropriate, you can reach out to me on Twitter at Dr. Floros with a suggestion. So briefly, I mentioned that in July 2021, the Tunisian president, Kais Saied, suspended parliament and dismissed the prime minister. In September of 2021, he issued Decree number 117, which allowed him to rule by decree, giving him broad authority over all branches of government without parliamentary approval or other checks on authority. In March 2022, Rached Ghannouchi, the Speaker of the Parliament, leader of the largest political party in Tunisia, Ennahda, and one of the people I met when I went to Tunisia in 2017. He held a virtual parliament where most of the members who attended criticized the president. Saied responded by formally dissolving the already suspended parliament. Having successfully replaced the judicial and election authorities with loyalists, on July 22, 2022, the president held a constitutional referendum to center power in the country in his hands. The referendum passed with only 30% turnout and accusations of fraud. This was followed in December 2022 and January 2023 with 2 rounds of voting for a new parliament. These elections were boycotted by the opposition, and each round drew only 11% turnout. Throughout this period, opponents of the president have found themselves in increasing legal jeopardy. After convening the virtual parliament in March 2022, Ghannouchi was barred from leaving the country while he was being investigated for his potential role in the 2013 deaths of 2 left-wing politicians. In July, ahead of the constitutional referendum, his assets were frozen in connection to money laundering and campaign finance violation charges. In November, ahead of the first round of parliamentary elections, he went to court on 2 separate cases. In early November, there was a hearing related to the money laundering case. While that case is still active, no subsequent hearings have been scheduled. In late November, Ghannouchi was in court giving testimony on allegations that he encouraged Tunisian extremists to go to Syria and fight with ISIS. This is known as the shipment of jihadists case. Undeterred, Ghannouchi continued to speak out against President Saied. He was arrested in April 2023 after making a statement at a meeting of opposition leaders that suggested that excluding Islamist and leftist parties from government was a recipe for civil war. The charge was plotting against state security. The next day, the offices of Ennahda all over the country were searched and closed. At the end of April, a judge ordered that Ghannouchi, who is 81 years old, be held in detention until trial. May 2023 brought the most serious legal consequences for Ghannouchi to date. He refused to leave detention for a hearing about yet another criminal charge. In February 2021, in a eulogy for a deceased party member, Ghannouchi praised the deceased for fighting against tyrants. A member of the police union filed a complaint that Ghannouchi was referring to the police when he mentioned tyrants. Ghannouchi was charged with incitement under an anti-terrorism law. But, as I said, he refused to appear in court because of the perceived ridiculousness of the clearly political charge. On May 15th, 2023, he was convicted on the incitement charge and sentenced to 1 year in prison. Just FYI, another person I met on my trip, Noureddin Boutar, The director of the independent radio station Mosaic FM was also arrested this year. He was arrested on February 13th, 2023, and released on May 25th. I should probably stop meeting government officials when I go abroad. The second piece of business before we get to my interview with Semih Patan is that I realized that in my first conversation with Semih, we were talking about forms of government, voting, and a bunch of other concepts that folks who aren't politics nerds might not know very much about. Therefore, I sat down with UIC political science professor Petia Kostadinova for a brief introduction to different political systems around the world. Professor Petia Kostadinova, thank you for joining me in the politics classroom for a quick tutorial of different types of governments.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So an intro to comparative politics class would take most of a semester to cover what I hope to cover in less than 30 minutes. So let's jump right in. Are you ready?
Sure, as ready as I'll ever be.
Okay, great. So for a country to be considered a democracy, what features must it have? Are elections enough?
Short answer is no. So elections by themselves are necessary but not sufficient.
Okay.
So during communism, there were elections, non-competitive, but there were. So just having elections doesn't mean much. So elections are necessary but not sufficient. What else is to be added to the procedural components of democracy? Some sort of a competition between parties or candidates, some sort of a choice that citizens have. The competition aspect also relies on media to communicate these choices to citizens and citizens to be informed of the different positions and the different choices that they have. A third element would be accountability for those in office, ability to remove them from office through competitive elections the next cycle, their ability to accept the loss of office and loss of the elections, and some sort of even legal ramifications if the holders of the office holders do something that is illegal, being able to be held accountable either through elections or through other legal means. So that's on the side of the elites. And then on the citizen side, you have the rights of citizens for voting, expression, freedom of association, freedom to run for office. A number of democracies add social rights to the rights of citizens. Scandinavian countries, for example, the right to education, healthcare, and things like that. But generally, the rights, the legal rights, the civil rights are considered an important element of all democracies. And so that's on the procedural sort of side. And then substantively, democracy is about representation, some sort of a linkage between the voters and the elected officials. That can be done in any number of ways and can take any number of forms, but there needs to be some sort of a connection between I, as a voter, this is what I wish to see happen, this is what I wish the government to do, and then the government actually doing what I think I wished, and then me holding them accountable for that if they don't do what I thought they should do. And again, that's the trickiest part of the substantive representation. You can have strong or even longer lasting procedural democracies where that element, substantive representation, is lacking. Or it's weak, and that can undermine the procedural aspects of a democratic system if consistently citizens change who is in power, but the policies don't change, or the policy outputs. And one example of that is during the 90s in a lot of Eastern European post-communist countries that come just kind of communism, and they had frequent elections, frequent changes in the governing parties. But for the most part, they all pursued neoliberal economic reforms. And so citizens would vote for a different party with the hope that the reforms would slow down or be mitigated or changed, or there will be some social protections as a result of these reforms, but that wouldn't necessarily happen. And the changes in government parties didn't necessarily reflect changes in governing policies. And that was the substantive representation was sort of lacking there. That later on that contributed to the dissatisfaction with democracy in these countries, and outright democratic backsliding in a number of them. It's not the main reason, but certainly one of it. And then, of course, you can have non-democracies or weaker democracies where some groups of citizens get substantive representation. In Turkey, most recently, we had certain electorates that are preferred by the ruling parties. So again, substantive representation by itself is not necessarily even a necessary aspect of democracy, but it's sort of adding layers to the procedural aspect of it.
Okay, so elections, competition, accountability, the people being linked to the people they elect and being able to hold them accountable, and the voters, I guess, writ large, their preferences actually reflected in the outputs that the government does.
Right.
Okay, next question. So democracies and also non-democracies, but we're focused on democracies, come in many shapes and sizes. Can you briefly describe the features of both presidential and parliamentary systems?
Okay. The main elements of difference is that in a parliamentary system, the branches of the legislative branch and the executive branch are connected. As a citizen in these countries, you don't vote directly for your executive, the head of government. You vote for legislature. The legislature then selects the prime minister and their cabinet, and that is the executive. The connection is that the executive can at any time resolve the legislature. There is no fixed terms of office, which is another element of difference. The presidential system, as we know in the United States, you vote, you know exactly when the next elections are going to be. In the parliamentary system, you don't. There are certain constitutional terms you must hold elections within the next 4 or 5 years, but when those are going to happen, you don't know. So the executive can then dissolve the legislature, can kick them back to the voting booth. This actually happens very frequently. It happened in Spain a week ago. It's a major, big issue when the prime minister in Spain decided to dissolve parliament and call for early elections. Happened in Montenegro in 2023. Again, it happens quite frequently.
In Israel, didn't it happen like 4 or 5 times in 2 years?
Yeah, it's one of these very frequent occurrences. The other aspect of the connection is that the legislature can kick the executive out as well. They can replace the executive at any time if they're not happy with the cabinet. The cabinet, the executive functions if they have support from the legislature. That often means 50% plus one votes in the legislature through either a single party, which is rare, that controls 50% of the legislature, or more often a coalition of parties that control the majority of the legislature. But that dependency between the executive and the legislative branches is sort of the defining characteristics of a parliamentary system. So in a parliamentary system, then the head of government is selected by the legislature. In presidential systems, there's a clear separation of powers. There's clear division of the two branches. You vote for legislature, and then you vote for an executive, which is the head of, and then the head of state is the head of government, the president. Then the two roles are linked there, often overlapping, but the selection of the legislature is independent from the selection of the executive, at least in principle.
Okay, so can you just really quickly talk about the difference between a head of state and a head of government? And if the prime minister is the head of government in a parliamentary system, who is the head of state? And what does that person do?
Yeah. So the head of state is typically a ceremonial role. Let me put it this way. If a country is a monarchy, well, the monarchy is the head of state, but you don't elect one. You have a separately elected head of government. Countries that are not monarchies, instead of a monarch, they have a president, head of state. And that is the position that is to represent the entire country versus a particular group of political factions through the legislature. And so in countries, again, that don't have monarchies, they have a president through, and that's the head of state. They can be directly elected, often is, for a popular vote, but it doesn't have to be. A number of countries, and I'm primarily going to be giving examples from European countries, that's what I know the best, but a number of countries, Italy, Germany, tend to have a president, head of state, that is elected or selected by the legislature through various procedures, and then that position then again serves a lot of ceremonial. They don't have a day-to-day executive role in running the country. If a foreign dignitary goes to visit, or a foreign monarchy, that's the person who greets them at the tarmac, the person who represents the country.
All right, so head of state is largely ceremonial. Head of government runs the government. In the United States, for example, right, the president is both the head of state and the head of government. But in many places, there's a prime minister who runs the government, and either a monarch or an elected or indirectly elected president who holds those ceremonial functions. So can you talk about the pros and cons of each system?
Yeah. So oftentimes when I talk to American students about these systems, they see, especially European countries, the ones that I teach, oh, that sounds very unstable, very unpredictable. You don't know when the next elections are going to be. You vote, and it can take months to form a new government if it's a coalition government. So parliamentary systems have this impression of being unstable and messy, and they can be. There is much less predictability in that sense. What is a big advantage for the parliamentary systems is the ease with which the government can be replaced if they have lost the confidence of the legislature or the confidence of the people. When you have a situation where the government is no longer representative substantively of the preferences of the majority of the legislature, but by extension majority of the voters, then you can replace them. You don't have to wait until their term expires to remove them from office.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a government instability, but it translates into longer regime stability. You're not questioning then is democracy the right regime for us if we're stuck with these people for the next foreseeable future. In a presidential system, because you can't easily remove the executive, you need to wait until the next elections where you can try to impeach them, which is relatively rare, relatively difficult. Then there's a higher risk of regime instability, of dissatisfaction with the current establishment can translate into a dissatisfaction with the regime overall.
And by regime, you mean like we're frustrated with how our government is not representing us. And so because we can't get rid of them, that frustration with our government might be a frustration with democracy.
Correct.
And thinking, okay, it's okay if we become slightly less democratic if it means whatever it means. So when you talk about regime stability, it means democracy's lasting.
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, at least in theory, that is the association. I think you can see it in practice more recently, but when you can now, the substantive aspect I talked earlier, when you can still change the government and not lead to any policy change, that can still be frustrating. But at least you have the mechanism, and it can happen fairly frequently. I mean, not to get too bogged down in this example, but in Bulgaria, where I grew up, we've had 5 parliamentary elections in 3 years, and there hasn't been a coalition agreement. There hasn't been enough support within the legislature to actually form a majority to elect the government. One got elected today for the first time in 10 months, so we're very, very excited to see how long it's going to last. So, and that kind of instability can also undermine support for democratic regimes because it is seen as this is clearly not working.
Mm-hmm.
What seems to be leading in this case is, oh, maybe the parliamentary system's not working. Maybe the current president is sort of making insinuations for a presidential system.
Mm.
There isn't a strong anti-democratic tendency yet, but there's certainly an anti-system tendency.
Yeah, and I think that that's actually the argument that the sitting president of Tunisia made when he dismissed Parliament and took over, basically, was that the system as they had it wasn't working, and so they needed a new constitution for a more effective system.
Right.
But
right.
he dismissed Parliament and is jailing all his opponents. But that's another conversation. Okay.
Right.
So presidential may be like you don't have elections every 2 seconds, but you can't throw the bums out until the next scheduled election. And so you're stuck with who you have, even if they no longer have the confidence of the country.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So most political actors belong to political parties. So can you talk about the role of political parties in each of these two systems that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so because modern democracies are representative democracies, parties are the units that aggregate the interest of voters and can facilitate the linkage between voters and the legislature. There isn't really, at least to my mind, a big difference in the role of parties in the different systems, so much as it's linked to, I guess, the more historical reasons for why certain countries or certain types of political systems. What I mean by this is that the parliamentary systems tend to be a remnant of the British Empire. I mean, the United States is an obvious exception here, but a number of around the world, because they also belong to Commonwealth and their head of state is the British monarch. Those countries don't have their own president, but they also tend to have parliamentary systems, and they have then also inherited the electoral systems of the United Kingdom. The presidential systems tend to be associated or remnants of the Spanish or Portuguese colonialism, where independence happened as a way to overthrow the colonial power that tended to be a particular monarch, and then resulted in a presidential systems, and their political parties then reflected those cleavages and the systems that they had. Certainly in parliamentary systems with proportional representation, the role of political parties tends to be more pronounced. They, in the sense of voters can participate in candidate selection if they're members of the political party and participate through the structures of the political parties. In other systems, voters can have much more direct role in selecting candidates. And so then party organization, party control, and that's another thing that my students often notice when we talk about these things. Even in strong democracies, the parties themselves as internal organizations, they may be non-democratic or not as openly democratic. They could be very hierarchical organizations and very closed to input from outside of the organization. And then are they reflecting really the interests of the voters, or are they reflecting the interests of those activists who are participating in the party?
So you were talking about coalition governments in parliamentary systems, and so that implies that there are multiple parties that have to come together to form a coalition. So are a large number of parties more associated with parliamentary versus presidential, or is it the kind of voting rule or the electoral rules of proportional representation versus first past the post, which we need to explain what each of those two things are as well.
So yes, certainly the number of parties and then the party systems tend to be a reflection of the electoral system rules. The political system, presidential, parliamentary, that's sort of a separate component, but it's the electoral system affects the party system. Again, going back to British Empire, the first past the post is a system that is a plurality rule. First past the post literally means the first one to cross the line. Doesn't matter by how much. You can win an election or a seat by as low as 20% of the vote or fewer. What this system also means is the single member district system. You can only elect one representative per district. And there is this so-called Duverger law and political science, one of the very few law-like relationships in social sciences, where if you have first past the post system, you almost always have a two-party system. Where the rule breaks is unless you have a geographically concentrated minority. Canada, Scotland. So in the United Kingdom, you have an effective third party. They're not very prominent at the federal level, but they have replaced the Labour Party in Scotland. It's
The Scottish National Party.
Scottish
Yeah.
National Party has emerged as a third party in the UK, and they have, because it's geographically concentrated constituency there. So in those kind of systems, you can have a third party emerging if it's geographically concentrated. If it's not, then it's a two-party system. Then you have a sort of variation. France has it. A number of other countries where you still have a single member district, still elect one representative per district, but they need a majority of the vote. And if they don't get a majority in the first round, there is a second round of elections. And by definition, then that person has a majority of the vote, which tends to be a bit more representative. Plurality systems are very disproportionate. You can end up with a legislative majority that is reflective of a minority of the population, especially with gerrymandering and the way the district is structured. And then you have a number of countries that have, probably even the majority of the countries have some version of a proportional representation where you have multi-member districts. You elect more than one person per district. The Netherlands is an extreme example. The entire country is one district, 150 seats, a list of 150 candidates. And that's where the party organization thing that I talked about earlier comes in. Like, and then strictly speaking, PR system, proportional representation, many of them are so-called closed list. The voters go to the booth and have a literal list of names that the party has selected. The party has decided the order in which these are going to appear. They may or may not be reflective of gender or ethnic or other makeups of the electorate. And then voters have no choice. They either support the party. If they support the party, they vote the entire list, even if they disapprove of individual candidates. In a first-past-the-post system, those are much more candidate-centered. There's still political party labels, but there is much more competition between candidates, even within a single party for nomination. But recently, there's been a tendency in parliamentary system, well, I should say in PR systems, to have a variation of an open list PR. Typically, that includes some sort of a preference vote. Yes, the voters still get a list. They still support the party or not, but with that, in that list, they can rank order candidates, or they can circle the preferred candidates. So when the votes are tallied, the person who gets elected from the district, that is a reflection of the number of preferences that they received by the voters of that district. So it still gives voters some choice within the system. But those parties, the PR systems, tend to result in multiple parties at the legislative level.
Okay. And so if we have a district and, that district, because of its population, is allocated 10 seats, and there are 5 political parties contesting in that district, each party will have a list of up to 10 people. Everybody goes to the polls, votes for the party that they want to see in power. And then the number of seats each party actually gets is based on the proportion, thus the name, proportional representation, PR, the proportion of the votes they actually get. So if one party gets and at the margins, it's not exact, right? But one party gets 20% of the vote, the top 2 candidates on their list get seated, et cetera, until all the seats are allocated. And then each district will then send their folks. And so that's how you end up with people from different parties representing the same district, but more seats are allocated to the parties that have a larger proportion of the support in the country.
Correct.
Okay, so I'm not getting this done under 30 minutes, but let's just ask if you have anything about electoral rules, political parties, separation of powers, anything that you think is relevant for an intro level explanation that we have not already covered.
One thing I wanted to talk about relevant to political parties, and I think it gets not as highlighted as I think it should be is the notion of the origin of the different ideologies of political parties. And oftentimes, and this is really more true for the context of European context, but I think some of this is relevant to any number of countries, but the type of political parties that exist in modern times tended to emerge as a result of a national revolution for state formation, some sort of a challenge to the system, either a monarchical rule or colonial rule, and then industrial revolutions that happen in Western Europe. So as a result of these processes, then you have well-defined, at some point still very relevant cleavages. You have the worker-owner cleavage, which is most often associated with the industrial revolution and the left-right political spectrum that we talk about. The other cleavage associated with the industrial revolution is the urban-rural, the tension between the city centers that needed workers and the land owners that needed farm labor, and the tensions that resulted in these type of political parties that emerged. And with the national revolution, starting with the French revolutions, you had the tension between church and state and the type of religious parties that emerged there, and as well as the center periphery with who belongs to the state, what is the territory that the state controls. And I mention these because, again, most people think about political parties on the left-right spectrum, but I think recently, certainly we've seen with identity politics and also with other tensions, we have seen a number of other cleavages becoming very prominent. I mean, certainly in the United States, seeing it in Europe as well, the urban-rural cleavage is the main one. You can map out the support for political parties based on where you live in a city or suburbs or not.
Yeah.
And that is the strongest cleavage. In a number of European countries, you will have seen the center periphery, the Catalan independence, Scottish independence, and a number of parties are becoming more relevant because they're advocating on that type of cleavage. And I think during the Cold War, a lot of these cleavages kind of were subdued, or kind of they were overtaken by the left-right worker cleavage. But then as that cleavage is weakening with the changing service economy, with who is an owner, who is a worker, that's a little bit less clear now. These other cleavages began to resurface, and they're still there. They're still quite relevant. And the reason I bring it up because it's important, because those worker owner cleavage can be changeable, right? You can change your identity in terms of your occupation. You can also change your identity based on where you live, city or rural. Center periphery is kind of hard, rooted into a more immutable kind of changes, type of identities, and then about religious issues, and that becomes very hard for then citizens to even compromise to some extent, right?
Yeah.
When you're talking about those kind of issues and parties that draw support on those issues versus, strictly speaking, policy, left, right, that can be changed.
Can you talk for 2 minutes about Islamic parties?
So, with the caveat that I'm totally not an expert on Islamic parties, I would see them more as a church-state sort of a party, falling on that cleavage. That's the cleavage of what is the role of religion in personal life, who gets to decide what type of education would children get, who determines that. And historically, the Catholic Church, if you wanted to learn to read, you were part of that establishment. Marriage, baptism, that came through the church, and then the state replaced those functions in personal life. And still, in many democracies, that's the way it is, even if people choose to have a religious aspect added to it. So that, to me, the Islamic parties then fall into that kind of a cleavage. Who gets to determine issues of morality and personal life? Is it the religious authorities, or is it the state? And that is one of the older cleavages out there. And I wouldn't put them, they can cross-cut with left, right, but to me, it's an independent sort of a cleavage. Yeah.
Right. And thank you so much for highlighting the Catholic Church, because in Germany there's a Christian Democratic Party, right?
Right.
And so it's not, we hear about Islamist parties, but there are certainly parties that are affiliated with any name of religion, and there is somewhere in the world a political party that's geared in that direction.
The religious parties are not unique to the Islamic world by no means.
Okay, great. Well, Professor Petia Kostadinova, thank you so much for talking about these systems with me. You teach Intro to Comparative Politics, where I'm sure you cover a lot of these topics, and so I appreciate you helping me illuminate my listeners. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and I really enjoyed talking to you and to people about those issues.
Thank you.
Let's take a break. You're listening to Professor Floros in the Politics Classroom, a podcast of UIC Radio. Welcome back to the Politics Classroom, a podcast of UIC Radio. I'm Professor Floros, and now I'd like to bring you the rest of my conversation with UIC political science PhD candidate Semih Patan. Okay, so we talked about how these democratic reforms, either to get into the EU or not, depending if we're cynical, weaken the ability of the military to intervene to course correct if it felt the government was straying beyond its constitutional limits. And you described in 2007 a military attempt to prevent someone from becoming president because his wife wore a headscarf, that the AKP stood up to that. But in 2016, there was a coup attempt that was ultimately unsuccessful, but it was a faction of the military attempted to take control of the government. Erdogan was on vacation at the time when this coup attempt was initiated. How close did Erdogan come to being overthrown in a coup? How close was this to success?
I guess it was pretty close, but in terms of if you compare to the standards of Turkish military's code of conduct when it comes to staging a coup, this was a poorly executed one for various reasons. But they did come close. They did intend to take over. They did intend to at least capture Erdogan, if not kill him. But I think he, evacuated his summer house way ahead of time and was already on a plane and safe. But I think an F-16 fighter jet did want to engage, but did not do so. But the evidence is not really out there for us. We don't really know exactly the minute details of how things played out. I was in Turkey at the time. It was really, really hard to believe what was happening. It started as a joke on Twitter, like a rumor. Oh, there is some military activity. What is going on? A coup? And turns out, yes. And the thing, was that it happened, like it was taking place at such an odd hour that you wouldn't expect it. The rumor started around 9 p.m. When everybody is awake, and you don't really try to overthrow someone unconstitutionally through use of force when everybody is awake. It's just not really the way to go. But turns out their plans were foiled in the beginning, so they had to kind of start early and as soon as possible before the rest of the military kind of collect itself and respond. But yes, they failed, and it was a faction within the military which is also representing a certain Islamist ideology. So the leader of which is currently residing in Pennsylvania, United States, Fethullah Gulen, whose supporters were basically behind this atrocity. Fighter jets bombed the Turkish parliament, which is a very dramatic and sad thing to just watch over TV. They killed their own people. They killed civilians who were heroically resisting this military coup attempt. I may not agree with their politics, but of course, resisting a military coup against a civilian government is something heroic in my book. So whatever the intentions were for the aftermath of the military coup that was being planned, it just did not play out as they wanted. And of course, this fight between the government and the supporters of Fethullah Gulen goes back in history, and it is, to me, AKP and Erdogan himself to blame because he cozied up with this clandestine groups, and they had a falling out, and they went so far ahead to commit this treasonous act against their own country. But yes, it failed, and Erdogan averted being overthrown, and of course welcomed by and embraced by his own supporters, and that boosted his popularity for a while. But it also allowed him to become much, much more authoritarian under the guise of cleaning the state from the sympathizers or the members of this Gulenist terrorist organization. So he used this very conveniently to also target his opposition, anyone he deemed politically dangerous. It was a convenient excuse to just get rid of him by accusing them of being this Gulenist terrorist organization sympathizer or being associated with it. They use this very vague legal, it's not even legal term, it's not officially recognized term, and it doesn't mean anything. Being associated, it's not even associated, but it's a very weird word. And by just that, they can get rid of anyone from the government, from the state, or just take over political offices.
This affected tens of thousands of
Absolutely.
Turkish people, right?
Yes, and their families. A lot of those people were sympathizers, supporters of Gülenists to a certain degree, but there are many people who are just targeted for no real legitimate reason because they were either a family member of the person who was associated with them, or they were, again, a government critique or some politically dangerous people. So it was a catch-all term for anyone Erdogan did not really like. A very powerful delegitimizing tool.
And what are those people doing today?
If you're just associated somehow with the shaky evidence, what they do is they make sure you're not employed by the government.
Okay.
Or employed by any other as well. And government support like Social Security is cut off. You're basically a person with nothing. So you're just ostracized.
And they either somehow exist in the informal economy or they
usually
leave?
Or they try to leave, but they also, most of them have suspended passports. So the government will suggest that they're not targeting anyone who's not really associated with this organization, but many human rights reports and certain members of parliament have been investigating these allegations, and they argue that this is not really the case. There are thousands of people that are falsely accused, and even if the government does not take any action, just the accusation itself is enough for others to distance themselves from you, right? That in and of itself is also a tactic. Just make the accusation if you're not happy with this specific person, and let things run its course in its natural way, I guess. And people just distance themselves from these, citizens who are somehow accused, even though those who are cleared through investigations sometimes end up not getting their rightful employment back.
Okay. Well, one of the other actions that may have come as a function of the coup is that there was a constitutional referendum in 2017, And so you had said that Turkey was a parliamentary democracy, right? Meaning the prime minister was the head of the government and parliament set the rules, et cetera, and the president was more of like a figurehead, had much more limited role in day-to-day governing. But in 2017, there was a referendum on a constitutional changes that would change Turkey from a parliamentary democracy into a presidential system with an executive president. So can you talk about how extensive a change, and because the referendum passed, did mean for Turkey, and what the arguments were of those who opposed this constitutional change of why this was not a great idea?
Right. I mean, it wasn't a great idea to, even if there wasn't any cynical reason to make this change, then just like, why make it, right? Turkey has a long history of parliaments, parliamentary democracy. It just doesn't really fit the needs and institutional and historical codes of this nation. So it would have been a very unnecessary thing to do, even if Erdogan aimed at a democratic presidential system. It just did not make any sense to begin with. But of course, we wanted to have executive power embodied in himself without having to rely on the parliament for gaining that power, right? And we can see why, actually, to a certain extent. AKP won only like 35.5% of the votes in this recent elections. That is not enough to win the majority of the seats, given there are so many other parties in the parliament that deny that majority. So by not having to rely on a parliamentary majority and his own party's popularity, Erdogan just wanted to rely on his own popularity, and he remains popular so that he could just like get the executive powers, however unpopular the political party itself is. So that was I think, main motivation, kind of like detach this power from his party and just wanting to get it through his own personal charisma. So that was the reason, and how extensive it goes. A lot of people, if I guess Americans, would think, of course, when they think about presidential system and compare it to their own system, and it's nothing like that. So imagine Donald Trump being the head of his party, but also being able to field his own candidates for the Senate and for the Congress, deciding who gets to be the members of Congress. And this is, of course, not the case in the US because there is a clear separation of powers, which is the whole gist of the whole idea of a presidential system, strict separation of powers. In Turkey, they are connected. Erdogan is the chairman of AKP. Erdogan is the one who gets to decide the party fields as members of parliament, as a candidate. So he controls the parliament and he controls the executive through this, because this parliament, like party discipline in Turkey is very, very high, and the political party law in Turkey allow for a very authoritarian way of governing intra-party business.
But so if AKP only has 35% of the seats, approximately, and therefore not a majority, so he may control the actual people who hold AKP's seats, but if they don't have a majority, how does he still control parliament?
That's the thing that he did not clearly think about it as much. But
Okay.
The thing is, so far it worked, right? In 2018 elections, first of all, AKP had a much higher vote share and much higher seat allocation. But this system was advocated as something that would prevent coalition government in Turkey. And Turkish political history is just marred with all these infighting between political parties. This coalition era in 1990s. Turkish voters basically have a very negative perception of politics in 1990s due to all these failing coalition governments. So Erdogan was marketing this whole system change as, oh, this will bring stability, political stability. There will be no need for a coalition. But it actually brought alliance politics because, he did not specify in the constitutional referendum that the person with most votes would be selected the president, but 50% plus one. And Erdogan never gained 50% votes in his life in this parliamentary democracy. The highest vote his party received was 47%. So it would always fall short. So you would always have to rely on some sort of an alliance. And we know actually through rumors and party insiders that he is very unhappy with this part of this new system, that he shouldn't have accepted 50% plus one, just suggested that whoever got the most votes in the first round wins the presidency. But of course, that is not the case. So now Erdogan has to rely on alliances, and this Nationalist Party is his major political partner now, and they have 10% of the votes in the parliament, and that it gives them enough seats for forming a single party government.
Okay.
They used to. If this was a parliamentary democracy, then through this coalition, they would have been able to form this single party government. But now, of course, it's a presidential system, so the forming a government does not require a parliamentary approval. But for passing any laws, now they need their alliance partners' votes as well. So far, they have performed well. They avoided major crises. This is how he basically controls. What happened was Nationalist Party did not get any representation in the government portfolio, but they have an increasing role in Turkish bureaucracy. So particularly the Turkish security bureaucracy and domestic security politics, this Nationalist Party is basically the veto player and has a much high influence. And this, of course, most makes itself apparent in government's policies towards the Kurds and Kurdish politics in general, and the Kurdish party stripping off Kurdish mayors from their offices, from their powers, and assigning trustees, basically, is an outcome of this newly formed alliance between the Nationalist Party and AKP.
Okay, so just to make sure I understand. So Erdogan in the second round got enough votes. He's reaffirmed as president. His party, though, only has about a third of the seats in parliament. But when they collaborate with this Nationalist Party, they have enough to get legislation through. If this were a coalition government in a parliamentary system, members of that Nationalist Party would be like the defense minister or the whatever. That isn't the case because it's a presidential system and the president gets to pick his cabinet or whatever. But this Nationalist Party has more sway in the different institutions of the country, specifically around security.
It's a much long-term strategy for them. So they get to assign, the district governors or governors, the chief of police, these kind of appointments are basically done through their own, they either get their own people assigned to these positions, or they get to approve who is being assigned.
Okay, lightning round, 2 questions. 1, if Erdogan had actually lost, would he have given up power?
Yes. Yes, he would. He would have tried. That also depends on what are the margins. If it's a clear victory, if it wasn't 50.1, right? So if the position of the opposition party and Erdogan swapped
52 to 48 the other way,
Erdogan would have, I think, given up power because he does not really have enough, I think, still both outside and institutional support that could dare to deny the opposition and the people's success and these democratic results. what differentiates Erdogan from other strongmen is Erdogan's whole legitimacy actually comes from his popular support. This is what the electoral results also show, that Erdogan, despite all his faults and terrible economy, people still support him, people still love him, and do not necessarily think all the problems within the country is Erdogan's fault, right?
Okay.
Somebody else's, maybe the parties, clearly the parties, because they lost lots of votes, but not Erdogan. So Erdogan is very popular, and I don't think he would have survived without popular support.
Okay. Question 2, which I meant to ask earlier. Was the constitutional referendum rigged by the Electoral Court, which allowed unstamped ballots to be counted? I don't know what any of that means, except that there were 1.5 million unstamped ballots that were accepted, maybe, and the referendum was only won by 1.4 million votes.
Yeah, this is hard to say because the unstamped votes in itself may not really mean much. There are ballots that are sent to each ballot councils, and you open those up, and they are pre-stamped by the High Electoral Office. And if this was a genuine mistake, without those stamps being there, it doesn't really mean much. It's just like, does that mean that there was some ballot stuffing without us knowing? And Turkish electoral system makes that really difficult if you are present as an opposition, because everyone gets to see the voting process and the counting is done right there, and every member of the ballot council, including the opposition, gets a signed version of the last tally. So if you have access to those as an opposition, and if you were present, there is no way for that vote to be stolen. The problem comes in when the opposition does not have a presence during those ballot counts, because there are certain districts, areas where even though people sign up on behalf of the opposition to be at the ballots, but they turn out AKP supporters.
Mm-hmm.
But in Turkey, that's never been to a degree that it would alter the results. Constitutional referendum is a little bit tricky. Maybe so, maybe not. We don't really know, but I tend to say no.
Okay. So even though the constitutional change doesn't make a lot of sense, it was legitimately approved through the referendum.
There were more irregularities for sure than usual, but I am not 100% that it ultimately affected the result itself.
Okay. And just FYI, that whole, you sign up for the opposition, but you're really AKP, that happens in Chicago, right? There have to be Democratic and Republican judges, and
yes.
The Republican judges in most places are just random people who sign up who aren't Republicans.
Right.
But they need Republican judges. So that's not just a Turkey thing.
Yeah, so they need to be really organized, and they still aren't. The opposition, I mean.
Okay, well, I could ask 5,000 more questions, but we both probably have other things to do. But I really want to thank you. Thank you, Semih Patan, for spending your time and helping us understand more about Turkey, its politics, and the most recent election. So thank you.
Thank you for having me and giving this opportunity.
Okay.
Semih Patan is a PhD candidate in the Political Science Department at UIC. Thanks for sticking with me in the Politics Classroom, a podcast of UIC Radio. I'm Professor Kate Floros. I'm on Twitter at Dr. Floros, so please contact me if you have any thoughts about the show or ideas for topics or guests for future episodes. If you want more information on the topics covered in today's episode, please check out the bookshelf section of the podcast website, thepoliticsclassroom.org. I'm hoping to release new episodes every 2 weeks, so until next time, class dismissed.